Hey guys, it's Jeff here at Metalworks. So for this week's single seat Pro R chassis update video, I'm going to do something a little bit different and start answering some questions that I've gotten throughout the years. For this week's video, I'm going to touch on the difference between DOM tubing and chromoly tubing, which is better, why you should use what, and hopefully clear up some of the myths and misconceptions that lead people to think that they should use a certain material. So just to start off, we got the chassis upside down. Obviously, I got all the second pass welds done, and I'm finishing up the welding on the trailing arm mounts. I got like 12 hours total in weld time on the trailing arm mounts alone. So I got a lot of cool footage from that. I've been trying to make the welding video that I'd like to do for next week. To date, I've got close to 200 hours total weld time on this thing. So it's a very, very time-consuming process. Last week, pretty much the bulk of my time went to tear down on the other vehicle. It's just, at the end of the day, I'm one guy. This isn't my full-time job. I do this on the side. I don't have a bunch of employees running around. I'm doing this project essentially as a favor to a friend. Yes, I'm being compensated for it, but at the end of the day, I don't have a bunch of employees running around. My friends always help out with my own projects, stuff like that, but for this one, I'm on my own. So I'm doing literally everything myself. So when I was tearing down the other car, I wasn't able to work on this. But that after I got that process finished, I got all the components off that I need to put into this for the next phase, which is going to be all the drivetrain, radiator, all the big things that we're reusing and need to be swapped over. So all those are out. As soon as this thing gets rolled back over and sat in the jack stands, I'm ready to start putting that stuff in. Shocks are getting sent down to Adam's shock guy, and as soon as we get those back, this thing is ready to set on its own weight. We got all the suspension parts and everything like that, so as soon as those shocks come back in a couple weeks, this is ready to sit on its own weight and have a seat in it and sit it and make motor noises. So it is coming along. It's just, like I said, it's kind of slow because at the end of the day, I am one person doing all this myself. So plus, I'm trying to document as much as I can and make some of these videos to hopefully inspire some other people to maybe build their own, or at least be a little more educated when they go to their fabricator and what they're expecting and stuff like that. So like I said, that's where we're at. Moving on to the material selection side of things. I'm sorry, this is going to be a little more like a lecture than a bunch of edits and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, I'm one person. I don't have time to do all that editing thing, so we're going to do it like this. So just jumping right into it. What's the difference between chromoly tubing and DOM? So a lot of people want to run chromoly because they think it's better. So why is it better? And hopefully your takeaway from this video is going to be that it's all personal preference. It doesn't matter what material you use. Either or is going to be perfectly fine. It's just personal preference on what you want. So that's the end, hopefully that's the takeaway from this. But why do people think chromoly is better? Well, a lot of it is misconception, okay? So the first misconception is that you can get chromoly just as easy as you can get DOM. And that's one thing that affected this project a lot. It started out as a quick down and dirty bare bones 2-seat that we were supposed to get ready for KOH, just swap everything over and go. And that was the idea. And then the next day, Adam decided he wanted to use chromoly. And Adam is more than educated on this subject. And like I said, at the end of the day, it's personal preference, and that was his personal preference. So he knew what he was getting into. He understands everything about this. But like I said, there are too many people who don't. So hopefully this clears up some of that. When we decided to use chromoly, my steel supplier that I use now, I can make a phone call right now and I can have tubing here tomorrow. No questions asked. Now when you talk about chromoly, that's a completely different story. It took me a week and like 18 different steel suppliers to be able to find somebody who would even work with me on trying to find it. Depending on where you're at in the country, it's extremely difficult to get. If you're in California watching this right now, you're probably laughing, but that's a reality of it. If you live on the East Coast and you've tried to get chromoly before, it's extremely difficult. Now, there are places like Online Metals, and which that's not going to work for what we need. We need full-size pieces of tubing, not the the 5-10 footers that you get from places like that. There are places that specialize, like stock car steel or whatever. 1 3/4 120 wall is like our bread and butter for what we do, and just pretty much in all of off-road until you get into the heavier 2-inch stuff. But 1 3/4 120 wall it's not a common material in chromoly, especially in like the dirt track and drag racing circles. That's a huge thickness that those guys just don't deal with. So the availability is a huge thing. It's very difficult to get this material on the East Coast. So after I found somebody who could actually get us the material, that took about a week. That whole shipping process turned into a giant fiasco, which I can do a whole video on why shipping just doesn't work. Seriously, I feel like everybody should have to deal with a shipping or a freight company at least once, just to, from a shipper's perspective, just to get a better idea of that. It's completely and totally fucked. So that our shipping situation, they ended up sending half of my shipment to Florida. It took over 3 weeks for the tubing to actually come in. So you have to understand that availability and just working with a certain material comes with certain consequences. So where we're at on the East Coast, choosing chromoly, that was it being a pain in the ass to get and deal with. That's just one of those consequences. So if before you decide what material you want to use, make sure you can get it. Okay. So the next misconception that people have about chromoly tubing is that it's lighter. And so what I have here is based on 1 3/4 120 wall, because again, that's our bread and butter. But if you take a 1 foot piece of 1 3/4 120 wall DOM tubing and put it right next to a piece of 1 3/4 120 wall chromoly tubing, they're both going to weigh 2.09 pounds. So chromoly tubing is not any lighter. That misconception stems from the fact that chromoly is a little bit stronger. So in other facets of the motorsports industry, they can use a thinner wall tube to really bring the weight down. Now, because we do things in the dirt, that it's just inherently more complicated and more expensive. So any tube that can touch the ground, and this is just general chassis building or cage building 101, but any tube that can contact the ground that's going to be a main structural component needs to be at least 1 3/4 120 wall, at least. Now, rule books, like our rule book for Ultra 4, I've been trying to get it changed for a while now, me and a couple other guys, and it falls on deaf ears. Because right now you can build a vehicle that's under 3,200 pounds, which is most side-by-sides, and according to the rules, 1.5 inch 120 wall is sufficient. So the way that rule works, either you can go up or down a size and tubing diameter and change the wall thickness. So 1.5 inch 120 wall means you can go to 1 3/4 095 wall. We all know if you're on the East Coast and do any type of rock bouncing or have any experience with building roll cages, whatever, we all know that 1 3/4 095 wall is not safe for even a roll cage on a side-by-side, let alone to build a whole chassis out of it. So, like I said, been trying to get that changed forever. Falls on deaf ears, but as a good rule of thumb, if it's a main structural component and it can touch the ground at all, it needs to be at least 1 3/4 120 wall. So we really don't have the ability to unlock the weight savings potential of chromoly, because there's so little tube in these things, and what tube is in there is pretty much a structural component, and it can touch the ground. So I mean, hell, I even started designing my roofs to be narrower to give more clearance in rocks. Like, if it is a tube on the outside of your vehicle, it is going to touch the ground, rocks, trees, something. Like I said, just because we do things in the dirt makes it more complicated. So again, the weight savings, it really doesn't come into play. Yeah, you can use a thinner wall tube for all the supporting tubes, but you can do that with DOM too. You can get the same weight savings that way with DOM that you can chromoly. So that's a non-issue. Now, strength. Yeah, chromoly is a little bit stronger, and a little bit. It's not a completely different material, it's just a little bit stronger. So the ultimate tensile strength of 4130 tubing is 90 to 97,000 pounds per square inch. Now the yield strength is 63 to 95,000 PSI, okay? Whereas on DOM, the ultimate tensile strength is 80 to 85,000 PSI. and the yield strength is 60 to 75,000 psi. So what does that mean? It means that yes, chromoly does have a higher tensile strength. But if your margin of error for whether or not your vehicle, whatever, whether it's a cage or a chassis, if your margin of error is dependent upon that extra 10, 15,000 psi worth of tensile strength, your design needs work, not your material, okay? Us doing what we do, our design dictates that for it to be strong enough for us to do what we're gonna do, DOM tubing is gonna be more than sufficient, okay? Like I said, if that little increase in tensile strength is what your design depends upon to be safe, then your design isn't safe. So yes, it's going to be safer or stronger if you use chromoly to a certain extent, but there's misconceptions with that as well. So when we're talking about the chemical makeup of it, 4130, yes, it does have a higher tensile strength, but what do we know about things that, what does higher tensile strength mean? Well, it also means it's a little bit harder. So what do we know about things that are hard? If anybody that's watching this has ever TIG welded before, or you know what tungsten is, tungsten is one of the hardest materials in the world. And what happens if I take a piece of tungsten ready to weld and I snap it in half? It splinters into a bunch of little tiny pieces. The harder something is, the more brittle it becomes. So now we have a higher tensile strength, we have a harder material. I didn't write down the Rockwell ratings, how hard, the hardness of either one of these materials, but chromoly is harder than regular mild steel. So that's something you have to be aware of. So chromoly has a 10 to 15% elongation before it breaks. So in that yield strength of ultimately 95,000 psi, and that's if the material was made on the best of days with the perfect chemical, composition, it can be 63,000 to 95,000 psi. But at the best of the best days, it's gonna fail at 95,000 psi. It's going to, at that 95,000 psi, it's going to deform 10 to 15% before it breaks. Okay, and that's, like I said, material was made on a Monday morning with the best of the best, right? Now with DOM, yeah, the yield strength is going to be at 75,000 psi, but that material is going to see a 15 to 23% elongation before it breaks. So what does that mean? That means that DOM or mild steel is going to be a lot more ductile than chromoly. So chromoly, stronger, yes, but more rigid and susceptible to fracturing, whereas DOM, yes, it's a little less on the tensile strength, but it's more ductile, so it's going to flex more before it's going to break and crack. So what does that mean if you're using it to build a chassis or a roll cage? So what does each one of these tubes do? Essentially it transfers a load, right? So in an off-road chassis, those loads are transferred a lot more than, say, like a dirt track car or a drag car. Those types of vehicles are going to see the same kind of forces applied to the chassis over and over and over again. Something like this, it's going to see a lot different kind of forces applied to the chassis constantly, just because of the terrain that we're going through and what we do with them. So there needs to be a certain amount of elasticity in these things, or we're going to start seeing cracks due to just life expectancy being less out of a harder chassis. So I use Steelit, I used to use Mavcoat, but all these coating products that are for race car chassis came about because they use chromoly and the incorrect application, and since it is more brittle, the lifespan is going to be a lot less because it starts to crack. So these really thin coatings came out so you can start to see those cracks sooner. It's not a secret, it's been that way for years. So that's one of the dangers of using chromoly as opposed to using mild steel, that it is more susceptible to cracking because it is harder and it is a little more brittle. So like I said, your design, if it's strong enough to be safe, it doesn't matter what material you're going to use. Now, where chromoly can become dangerous, I think, is when we get into the welding. So if you don't understand how to use it, this is where it can become dangerous. So yes, chromoly can be MIG welded. I don't care who says what. If somebody tells you that something can't be welded that way, I promise somewhere there's a procedure that says that, yes, this is the way that you have to do it. If somebody says it can't be welded that way, unless they're talking about welding 7075, I promise they just haven't been welding long enough. There's almost guaranteed to be a procedure for it. So yes, you can MIG weld chromoly tubing. People do it all day long. But the standard practice, the way that I'm doing it, the way we're doing it here, we're going to TIG weld it. So when you get into TIG welding, you got two options. Either you can use an ER70 filler material or an ER80 filler material or chromoly rod. So what do those numbers mean? So like a 60-10 welding rod, 70-18, the first two numbers on like stick electrodes are going to be the tensile strength. With TIG filler, ER70, ER80, those numbers are just the tensile strength. So with an ER70 rod, you're going to use that primarily on mild steel. The 70,000 pound tensile strength, it matches up really well with the parent material on mild steel. So common sense would say, okay, so now that chromoly has a higher tensile strength, we should use the ER80 wire, right? Well, people do that. But what happens is if you don't do a post-weld heat treat in like a stress relieving process, you now have a very rigid chassis with a very rigid weld, and the welds are going to crack at some point. Like I said, that's why we have the super thin coatings that we have today, because that's what happens. So what is a way to fix that without having to go through that extremely time-consuming and extremely expensive process of heat treating and stress relieving? Well, we can weld chromoly tubing with an ER70 filler material. It's been an accepted practice for the longest time. Most trophy trucks are going to be done like this. Until recently, sending entire chassis out to be heat treated just wasn't feasible for a lot of people. So the accepted practice has been to use a chromoly material with an ER70 filler. Now we have a filler with a lower tensile strength, but they're not dissimilar metals. They can be welded together, but even though it has a lower tensile strength, it has more ductility. So now all those stresses that are in that chassis and they converge into these weld joints, now that weld is more flexible or more ductile, and it can handle all those different types of stresses being applied to it. So if you don't know what you're doing when it comes to welding chromoly, yes, it is a stronger material, but if you muck it up in the welding process, it becomes a weaker material, okay? So as you can see, anything that's been welded, we see the colors, right? And these colors tell a story. So at the edge of this, that's called our heat affected zone. In any machinist's handbook or welding handbook, most of them are going to have a swatch in it, and they pick out what is the material and how thick is the material, and depending on those two things, hold the swatch up to it, and that color means that on that material and that thickness, it got exactly that temperature. So the lighter golds and stuff, that's a lower temperature. When you start getting into the blues and purples, that's a higher temperature. Now, when you start noticing that the color goes away and you start seeing just flat gray, that means that it got super hot. Just super, super hot. What happens to the material when it gets super hot? Well, it gets brittle. So now if you don't know how to weld chromoly and you got it super hot and you baked all the carbon out of it, now you have something that is even worse than just regular mild steel, okay? So you have to understand that yes, chromoly is stronger, but if you don't weld it properly, it's going to be weaker. So what do we know about it? It's hard to get. It's not any lighter. For what we're doing with this kind of stuff, the strength really doesn't matter. And if you don't use it right, it's going to break anyway, right? So for me, I'm a DOM MIG welding kind of guy. I TIG weld everything as much as I can, but DOM and MIG welding is perfectly sufficient for 99% of the things that you're going to build for the off-road world. This project, we were using 4130 tubing, and I'm welding it with an ER70 filler material. Why? Because yes, the chromoly is a little bit stronger. I can weld fairly decent, so I don't have to worry about making the material weaker. And at the end of the day, we want this thing to be an absolute showstopper, which I'm pretty sure it's going to be. So for this particular application, that was the route to go. And for yours, it might be different. But just understand that when you start a new project, or you're looking for a fabricator to build a cage or a chassis or something like that, please understand that the reasons why you want a certain material and why you might not need a certain material. Okay, so like I said, next week I'm going to do a video on welding, the TIG welding process specifically, but I'm going to get back over here and get the welding. So to all my friends who are at KOH, be safe, do something cool. I'm going to be watching on the television. And for everybody else, we'll see you here at Metalworks Motorsports next week, where hopefully this thing will have a drivetrain in it, and maybe I can sit in it and make motor noises. So we'll see. Hopefully we'll see you next week. Until then, take care.